The briefing room fell silent as the SEAL captain's voice cut through the tension like a blade. His eyes scanned the faces of the assembled special operations team, looking for something specific, something rare. The mission parameters had just changed, and what had been planned as a straightforward extraction now required an element they hadn't anticipated needing. Sarah Mitchell sat 3 rows back, her fingers drumming quietly against her thigh. She had been attached to this SEAL team as a logistics coordinator, making sure equipment arrived on time and that communication channels remained open between the field and command. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary, and she had earned her place among these elite warriors through competence and an unshakable calm under pressure. The captain continued laying out the problem. Intelligence had just confirmed that their target, a high-value informant who had been feeding them information about terrorist networks in the region, was now in immediate danger. The extraction window had collapsed from 72 hours to less than 6. The informant was holed up in a compound deep in hostile territory, and the only viable approach was by air, through a narrow mountain pass that made helicopter insertion impossible for anyone but the most skilled pilots. Their assigned pilot had been injured during a training exercise that morning. A torn rotator cuff meant he couldn't handle the physical demands of the flight controls, especially not for the kind of precision flying this mission demanded. The backup pilot was stuck 200 miles away, grounded by mechanical issues with his transport. They needed someone who could fly a combat helicopter, navigate through treacherous terrain in low visibility, and keep steady under enemy fire. "Do we have a combat pilot?" the captain asked, his voice carrying a note of frustration mixed with desperate hope. The room remained quiet. Everyone knew what this meant. Without a pilot, the mission would be scrubbed. The informant would likely be dead by morning, and months of intelligence work would evaporate along with any chance of stopping the planned attacks he had warned them about. Sarah felt her heart rate increase. She hadn't flown combat missions in over 2 years. After leaving active duty with the Army, she had transitioned into support roles, telling herself that she had done her time in the cockpit, that she had earned a quieter existence. The nightmares had faded mostly. The memories of close calls and friends lost had settled into a manageable corner of her mind. She had built a new identity, one that didn't revolve around the adrenaline rush of combat flying. But the captain's question hung in the air, unanswered. She knew every second of silence made the situation more critical. Her training kicked in before her conscious mind could overthink it. Without allowing herself to second-guess the decision, Sarah stood up. The movement was smooth and quiet, but in the stillness of the briefing room, every head turned toward her. The SEAL captain's eyes widened slightly. He had worked with Sarah for 3 months and knew her background included military service, but like most people, he had made assumptions based on her current role. Logistics coordinators didn't typically volunteer for combat missions. His expression shifted from surprise to scrutiny as he processed what her standing might mean. "Mitchell, are you saying you can fly?" His tone was careful, neither dismissive nor overly hopeful. He needed facts, not bravado. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the thundering of her pulse. "I flew Blackhawks for 6 years. 2 tours overseas. I have over 1,500 hours in combat zones, including mountain operations in Afghanistan." The room seemed to hold its breath. One of the SEALs in the front row, a grizzled operator named Hayes who had been on dozens of missions, turned fully around to look at her. His expression was unreadable, but Sarah could sense the wheels turning. These men trusted their lives to their team, and she was asking them to trust hers to her skills in a domain they had never seen her operate in. The captain pulled up her service record on his tablet, scrolling quickly through the information. Sarah knew what he was seeing: commendations, successful missions, but also a medical discharge notation, an injury that had ended her flying career, or so everyone had assumed. What the record didn't show was the year of physical therapy, the determination to regain full range of motion, the private flight hours she had logged to prove to herself that she could still do it. "Your record shows you were medically discharged," the captain stated, his eyes meeting hers directly. There was no accusation in his voice, only the need for clarity. Lives would depend on her answer. "I was," Sarah acknowledged, not looking away. "Shrapnel injury to my left shoulder from an RPG strike that hit near my bird during an extraction. I had surgery and full rehabilitation. I've been cleared by civilian flight physicians and I've maintained my certifications. I log flight hours quarterly to stay current. The tactical operations officer, Major Reeves, spoke up from the side of the room. Why aren't you listed as available for flight operations? His question was pointed but fair. Sarah had prepared for this question many times in her mind, though she had never expected to answer it in a situation like this. When I transitioned out of active duty, I chose a different path. Flying combat missions takes a toll, and I wanted to serve in a way that didn't require me to process another casualty or make another emergency landing under fire. But my skills are current and my ability is intact. The room remained tense. The captain glanced at his watch. They were burning precious minutes. He looked at Major Reeves, then at his team leader, a man called Frost who had earned his reputation through countless successful operations. Frost caught the captain's eye and gave a barely perceptible nod. If the pilot said she could fly, he was willing to trust that assessment. The approach is technical, the captain said, pulling up a topographical map on the main screen. You'll be flying nap of the Earth through this valley system, no more than 50 feet off the deck in some sections. There are known anti-aircraft positions here and here. He pointed to marked locations on the map. Visibility is going to be limited. Sandstorm is forecast to move through the area, which is actually to our advantage for concealment, but it makes flying exponentially more dangerous. Sarah stepped forward, studying the terrain. Her mind automatically began plotting approach vectors, identifying where the turbulence would be worst, where enemy fire was most likely. It was like putting on an old, familiar coat. The calculations came naturally, muscle memory of the mind. She could feel the collective attention of the room focused on her, waiting to see if she would falter. I can do it, she said simply, her finger tracing the route on the screen. I'll use this secondary approach here following the Wadi system. It adds 3 minutes to the flight time, but keeps us out of the direct line of sight from these positions. The terrain will provide natural cover, and if we time it right with the leading edge of the sandstorm, their radar effectiveness will be degraded. The captain studied her proposed route, then looked at his aviation specialist, who had been quietly analyzing the same map. The specialist nodded slowly, acknowledging that her tactical assessment was sound. The decision was made in less than 30 seconds. The captain looked at Sarah and said, "You're flying. Pre-flight in 20 minutes. Mission brief in 10. His voice carried the weight of command, but Sarah also detected something else beneath it. Trust tentative but present. These men were placing their lives in her hands based on a service record and a confident assessment of a flight path. As the room erupted into activity, team members gathering gear and running through final checks, Sarah felt the familiar mix of anticipation and focus settle over her. The logistics coordinator persona fell away like a shedskin. In its place emerged the combat pilot she had once been, the one who had earned her call sign Steady, because no matter how bad the situation got, her hands never shook on the controls. She made her way to the flight line where the Black Hawk waited, its rotors still in the darkness. The crew chief, a young sergeant named Kowalski, looked surprised when she approached with flight gear. "Ma'am, are you the pilot?" "I am," Sarah confirmed, beginning her pre-flight inspection with practiced efficiency. She ran her hands along the airframe, checking for any signs of damage or irregularity. Her fingers found the familiar contours of the aircraft and something inside her relaxed. This was home in a way that no briefing room ever could be. Kowalski watched her work for a moment before joining in. "Haven't seen you on the flight roster before." "I've been doing other work," Sarah replied, checking the rotor assemblies with careful attention. "But flying is what I know best." The crew chief seemed to accept this explanation. In the world of special operations, people often had skills that didn't show up in the standard duty roster. He had learned long ago not to ask too many questions. "She's been well maintained," he offered. "Last major service was 3 weeks ago. All systems checked out green this morning." Sarah nodded, continuing her inspection. The helicopter was in excellent condition, which was one less variable to worry about. As she moved through the checklist, muscle memory took over. Every switch, every gauge, every control surface was exactly where it should be. The 2 years away from the cockpit seemed to compress into nothing. Inside the aircraft, she settled into the pilot's seat and began running through the startup procedures. The instrument panel glowed to life, each indicator showing the health of different systems. She adjusted her helmet, tested the communication links, and felt the collective control under her left hand. Everything responded exactly as it should. Major Reeves climbed into the co-pilot seat. He was qualified on the Black Hawk, though not current enough to take the primary pilot role. "I'll handle navigation and communications," he said, strapping in. "You focus on flying." "Appreciated, sir," Sarah responded, continuing her checks. She could feel him watching her, assessing her movements. This was his team she would be carrying into danger. His scrutiny was not only expected but necessary. The SEALs began loading into the rear compartment. Sarah could hear their quiet voices, the sound of equipment being secured, weapons being checked one final time. Frost, the team leader, leaned into the cockpit. "Mitchell, my men are the best at what they do. I need to know you're the best at what you do." Sarah turned to look at him directly. His face was camouflaged, eyes intense beneath the paint. This was not a man who accepted anything less than excellence. "I am," she said simply. "I'll get you there and I'll get you home." Something in her tone must have satisfied him because he nodded once and moved back to brief his team. Sarah heard him say, "Our pilot knows her business. Trust her like you trust each other." Those words carried more weight than Frost probably realized. In the SEAL teams, trust was currency. It was earned through shared hardship and proven competence. He was extending that trust to her based on faith more than evidence, and Sarah felt the responsibility of it settle onto her shoulders. The engines spooled up, the familiar whine building to the distinctive thump of rotor blades beginning to turn. Sarah felt the aircraft come alive beneath her hands. The vibration, the sound, the subtle feedback through the controls. All of it was as familiar as her own heartbeat. She had forgotten how much she missed this feeling. "Tower, this is Hammer 2-1. Requesting clearance for departure," Sarah spoke into her microphone, her voice calm and professional. "Hammer 2-1, you are cleared for departure. Winds are light and variable. Good luck out there." The tower controller's voice carried a note of gravity. Everyone on base knew this was not a routine flight. Sarah increased collective pitch, and the Black Hawk lifted smoothly off the tarmac. The aircraft responded to her inputs with precision, and she felt a surge of confidence. Her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. She had been born to do this. They flew low and fast across the desert, the terrain rushing past beneath them in the darkness. Sarah was using night vision goggles, the world rendered in shades of green. Major Reeves called out navigational waypoints, and Sarah adjusted their course with minor corrections. The helicopter handled beautifully, responding to the slightest touch. Behind her, the SEALs sat in silence, each man lost in his own preparation ritual. Some checked weapons for the 10th time. Others sat with eyes closed, visualizing the mission. A few simply stared out the windows at the passing darkness. They had done this dozens of times before, but every mission carried the same weight, the same possibility that some of them might not return. As they approached the mountain range, Sarah began to descend even lower. The terrain became more complex, and she had to constantly adjust their altitude to stay below radar coverage. The helicopter skimmed over ridgelines and dove into valleys, following the natural contours of the land. Major Reeves watched the radar warning receiver and called out any potential threats. "We've got the sandstorm ahead," Reeves reported, pointing to the wall of dust visible on their sensors. "Looks like it's moving faster than forecast." "Good," Sarah replied. "We'll use the leading edge for cover. It'll cut visibility but mask our approach." She adjusted their heading slightly, timing their insertion to coincide with the storm's advance. The first gusts of wind hit the aircraft, and Sarah felt the Black Hawk shudder. She made immediate corrections, keeping them steady. The dust began to reduce visibility, and she relied more heavily on her instruments and instincts. This was where experience mattered. A less skilled pilot might have pulled up, seeking clearer air. Sarah pushed forward, using the degraded visibility to their advantage. They entered the narrow mountain pass that led to the target area. The walls rose steeply on both sides, and Sarah had to make constant adjustments to keep them centered. The wind swirled unpredictably in the confined space, creating turbulence that tried to throw the helicopter off course. Her hands moved continuously on the controls, feeling the aircraft, anticipating its movements, staying ahead of the conditions. "Tight fit," Reeves muttered, watching the proximity warnings as they flew between the rock walls. "I've flown tighter," Sarah said, her concentration absolute. Every ounce of her attention was focused on the narrow corridor ahead. There was no room for error here. A single mistake would end them all. In the back, Frost watched the pilot at work. He had flown with dozens of helicopter crews over his career, and he recognized exceptional skill when he saw it. Mitchell wasn't just flying the aircraft. She was dancing with it, reading the air currents, predicting the turbulence, making micro-corrections that kept them perfectly positioned. His initial doubts were evaporating with each passing mile. The radar warning receiver suddenly screamed to life. Someone had locked onto them with targeting radar. Sarah immediately threw the helicopter into a violent evasive maneuver, banking hard to the left while dropping altitude. The sudden movement caught everyone off guard, but her voice remained calm over the intercom. "We've been painted. Possible anti-aircraft system." Reeves was already working the countermeasures, deploying chaff to confuse the radar signature. "Can't get a clear read on the location. Signal is bouncing off these canyon walls." Sarah didn't need a clear read. Her instincts told her the threat was ahead and to the right, probably positioned on one of the higher ridges overlooking the valley. She adjusted their flight path, using a rock formation as cover while maintaining their forward progress. The radar lock broke, but she knew they would try again. "Hammer 2-1, be advised we're tracking multiple radio transmissions in your area." The voice from base command crackled in her headset. "Enemy forces may be aware of your presence." "Copy that," Sarah acknowledged, her eyes scanning the terrain ahead. The element of surprise was gone, which changed everything. They would need to move faster and be ready for contact the moment they landed. Frost leaned forward from the cargo area. "How long until we reach the landing zone?" 4 minutes at current speed, Sarah replied. "But if they know we're coming, we need to change the approach. The primary LZ might be compromised." She pulled up the tactical map on her display, quickly identifying an alternate location. It was farther from the compound, which meant the SEALs would have to cover more ground on foot, but it offered better cover from observation. "Recommend we use the alternate site, 200 meters north of the original." Frost considered this for only a second. "Agreed, my team can cover the extra distance. Better than landing in a hot zone if we can avoid it." Sarah altered course, bringing them around a massive rock outcropping that would shield their approach from the suspected anti-aircraft position. The maneuver added precious seconds to their flight time, but it was the smart play. Getting shot down would help no one. The Black Hawk emerged from behind the rocks at high speed, and Sarah immediately dropped them into a steep descent toward the new landing zone. The ground rushed up to meet them, and she flared the aircraft at the last moment, bleeding off speed while maintaining control. The wheels touched down with barely a bump, and before the rotors had even stopped spinning, the SEALs were pouring out. "Go, go, go!" Frost's voice carried over the sound of the engines as his team spread out in a defensive perimeter. Sarah kept the helicopter ready for immediate takeoff, her hands on the controls, eyes scanning for threats. Reeves was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, trying to get a picture of enemy movements in the area. "I'm hearing increased traffic on their tactical nets. They definitely know someone is here." Sarah watched the SEALs disappear into the darkness, moving with practiced efficiency toward the compound where their target waited. The crew chief had his weapon ready, covering one sector of their perimeter. The minutes stretched out, each one feeling longer than the last. This was always the worst part, the waiting while others were in danger. A flash of light erupted from a ridge about 1,000 meters away, followed a split second later by the crack of gunfire. The enemy had found them. Rounds began impacting around the landing zone, kicking up geysers of dust and rock fragments. Sarah kept the helicopter steady, but every instinct screamed at her to take off, to get away from the incoming fire. "Hammer 2-1, we are taking fire at the LZ," she reported to command, her voice still remarkably steady despite the bullet snapping past. "Copy. Hammer 2-1. Extraction force is spinning up but won't reach you for 20 minutes. 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours. Sarah knew they would have to hold this position or find another way out. The crew chief returned fire, his weapon barking in controlled bursts at the muzzle flashes on the ridge. The incoming fire didn't stop, but it became less accurate as the enemy took cover. Over the team radio, Sarah could hear the terse communications of the SEALs as they moved through the compound. "Building 1 clear. Moving to Building 2. Multiple hostiles engaging. Target located. Packages secure." The operation was proceeding despite the complications. More enemy fighters were arriving, drawn by the sound of gunfire and the presence of the helicopter. Sarah could see lights moving in the distance, vehicles responding to the incursion. They had minutes at best before the situation became untenable. "Frost, this is Hammer 2-1. Enemy reinforcements approaching from the east. You need to move now." Sarah keyed the radio, giving the team leader critical information. "Copy, Hammer. We're extracting now. 30 seconds. Frost's response was punctuated by the sound of gunfire in the background. Those 30 seconds felt eternal. Sarah watched the compound entrance, waiting for the team to emerge. The incoming fire was intensifying as more enemy fighters found their range. A round punched through the helicopter's thin skin behind her, and she felt the aircraft shudder. Damage indicators lit up on her panel, but nothing critical yet. Then they appeared, moving fast in a tactical formation with their informant in the center, a thin man in local dress who looked terrified but was running hard to keep up. The SEALs reached the helicopter and began loading, maintaining security even as they climbed aboard. Sarah kept the engines at full power, ready to lift off the instant everyone was secure. "Last man in," the crew chief shouted, and Sarah didn't hesitate. She pulled collective and the Black Hawk leaped into the air, even as enemy rounds continued to search for them. One struck the tail section with a metallic ping that Sarah felt through the airframe. But the helicopter remained airworthy. She kept the aircraft low, using the terrain for cover as she accelerated away from the landing zone. Behind them, the muzzle flashes continued, but they were already out of effective range. The first stage of the extraction was complete, but they still had to navigate back through hostile territory to reach safety. "We've got a hydraulic leak," Reeves reported, pointing to one of the gauges that was showing pressure dropping. "Not critical yet, but we need to monitor it." Sarah nodded, adjusting her flying to minimize stress on the damaged system. A hydraulic failure in a Black Hawk was serious but not immediately catastrophic. The aircraft had redundant systems, but she would need to be careful. Any violent maneuvers could accelerate the leak and potentially lead to a loss of control. In the cargo area, one of the SEALs was providing first aid to the informant, who had taken a round in the leg during the extraction. The man was conscious and talking, giving them information even as the medic worked on his wound. This was what they had risked everything for, intelligence that could save countless lives. The return flight was a test of Sarah's skill and the helicopter's resilience. She had to maintain speed to outrun potential pursuit, while also flying smoothly enough to prevent the hydraulic damage from worsening. The sandstorm that had provided cover on the way in was now a hindrance, reducing visibility and creating turbulence that stressed the aircraft. The hydraulic pressure continued to drop slowly but steadily. Sarah found herself having to apply more force to the controls to get the same response from the aircraft. The Black Hawk was becoming sluggish, less responsive to her inputs. She compensated by anticipating maneuvers earlier, giving herself more time to execute each turn and adjustment. "How's it looking?" Reeves asked, watching the gauge with concern as the needle crept toward the red zone. "We'll make it," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. The truth was they were in a race against time and physics. If the hydraulic system failed completely before they reached friendly territory, landing would become extremely difficult. Without hydraulic assist, the controls would be almost impossibly heavy to manage. Behind them, Frost moved forward to the cockpit area. "Mitchell, what's our situation?" Sarah gave him the facts without sugarcoating. "We're losing hydraulic fluid. The system is still functional but degrading. We have maybe 15 minutes before it becomes critical. We're 22 minutes from base at current speed." The math was simple and unforgiving. Frost processed it quickly. "Options? We can try to nurse it home, but we might have to put down short of base. There's an emergency landing strip about 12 minutes out. It's not ideal, but it's available." Sarah pulled up the location on her map display. "Or I can push the aircraft harder, get us home faster, but risk accelerating the hydraulic failure." Frost looked at the informant, who was still talking with one of his men, providing crucial information even in pain. The intelligence was already paying dividends. "Your call, pilot. You know this bird better than anyone here." Sarah appreciated the trust he was placing in her judgment. She ran calculations in her head, factoring in wind speed, current hydraulic pressure, rate of decline, and distance remaining. The variables were all there, but experience was what told her the answer. "We're going home," she decided. "I'm going to adjust our altitude and speed to minimize stress on the system. It'll take us longer, but we should make it." She eased back on the airspeed slightly and climbed to a more stable altitude where the air was smoother. Every control input was gentle and deliberate, nothing that would spike the hydraulic demand. The aircraft settled into a steady cruise, and Sarah watched the pressure gauge like a hawk. The next 10 minutes were tense. Everyone in the helicopter understood they were in a precarious situation. The SEALs sat quietly, not adding to the pilot's burden with unnecessary questions. They had done their part of the mission successfully. Now it was Sarah's turn to do hers. The radio crackled with a transmission from base. "Hammer 2-1, we've been monitoring your situation. Fire and rescue teams are standing by. Medical is ready for your informant. Bring her home, Mitchell." "Roger that," Sarah replied. The use of her name rather than just the call sign told her that people were paying attention. The captain who had asked if they had a combat pilot was listening, probably standing in the operations center watching her progress on the tracking screen. Reeves suddenly pointed ahead. "There, I can see the base lights." The glow of the installation was visible on the horizon, a beacon of safety that seemed impossibly far away despite being only minutes of flight time. The hydraulic pressure gauge was now firmly in the yellow zone, approaching red. Sarah could feel the controls becoming heavier in her hands. Each adjustment required more physical effort. Her shoulder, the one that had been injured years ago, was beginning to ache from the strain. She ignored it, focusing entirely on maintaining smooth, steady flight. 5 minutes out, Reeves announced. "You've got this, Mitchell." Sarah nodded but didn't speak. All of her concentration was on the aircraft and the approach ahead. Landing would be the most demanding part. She would need to precisely control their descent and touchdown, all with degraded flight controls. There would be no room for error. The landing lights of the base grew larger in her vision. She could see the runway, the emergency vehicles already positioned and waiting. The tower gave them priority clearance and Sarah began her descent. Every movement was calculated and smooth. She couldn't afford any sudden inputs that might overwhelm the remaining hydraulic capacity. "Gear down," she called, and Reeves confirmed the landing gear was extended and locked. The additional drag from the wheels made the helicopter even more sluggish, but they were committed now. There was no option to wave off and try again. The ground approached steadily. Sarah's hands worked the controls constantly, making tiny adjustments to keep them aligned with the landing pad. The crew chief was calling out their altitude. 50 feet, 40, 30. His voice was calm, professional, helping her gauge the descent without having to divide her attention. At 20 feet, Sarah felt the hydraulic system finally give up. The controls became dramatically heavier, requiring all of her strength to manipulate. The aircraft wobbled slightly, and she heard someone in the back intake a sharp breath. But Sarah's training and experience took over. She had practiced emergency procedures 1,000 times, including hydraulic failures. Using both hands on the collective and leaning her body weight into the cyclic, she arrested the descent and brought the Blackhawk level. The landing was harder than she would have liked, the skids hitting the tarmac with a solid thump that rattled everyone aboard. But they were down. The rotors continued to spin as she went through the shutdown procedure, her hands shaking slightly now that the crisis was past. "We're down. Good job, everyone," she announced over the intercom, allowing herself a moment of relief. The emergency crews swarmed the aircraft immediately. Medical personnel rushed to treat the informant, while maintenance teams began assessing the helicopter's damage. Sarah remained in the pilot seat, completing the post-flight checklist even though her hands were trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline. Frost appeared beside her, having dismounted with his team. He extended his hand. "That was some of the finest flying I've ever seen, Mitchell. You saved this mission and probably our lives." Sarah shook his hand, feeling the genuine respect in his grip. "Just doing my job," she said, though they both knew it had been far more than that. As she finally unbuckled and climbed out of the aircraft, Sarah saw the captain approaching across the tarmac. The same man who had asked if they had a combat pilot now wore an expression of respect and something else. Vindication, perhaps, that his decision to trust her had been correct. "Mitchell," he said, reaching her position. "That was exceptional airmanship. The informant is already talking, and the intelligence he's providing is exactly what we needed. This mission was a success because of you." Sarah felt the weight of the night settling onto her shoulders. The exhaustion, the stress, the fear she had pushed aside during the flight all came rushing back. But there was also satisfaction, the knowledge that she had been tested and had proven herself once again. The debriefing session took place 4 hours later, after everyone had been checked by medical and the informant had been secured in a safe location. Sarah sat at the conference table, still in her flight suit, nursing a cup of terrible coffee that somehow tasted better than it had any right to. Around her were the SEALs, the captain, Major Reeves, and several intelligence officers who had been brought in to hear the full account of the mission. The captain led the debriefing, methodically going through each phase of the operation. When they reached the extraction portion, Frost took over, describing how Sarah's early warning about enemy reinforcements had allowed them to adjust their exfiltration timing. Without that heads up, we would have run straight into a superior force. Mitchell's situational awareness extended beyond just flying the helicopter. She was thinking tactically for the entire mission. One of the intelligence officers, a woman named Captain Torres, leaned forward. The informant has already provided intelligence that we're acting on right now. He's identified 3 separate cells that were planning coordinated attacks. We're moving to interdict them within the hour. What you accomplished tonight is going to save lives, potentially hundreds of them. Sarah absorbed this information quietly. This was why she had done it. Why she had stood up when the captain asked for a pilot, not for recognition or glory, but because people's lives hung in the balance and she had the skills to help. It was that simple and that complicated. Major Reeves spoke up, his voice carrying a note of admiration. I've flown with a lot of pilots over the years. What Mitchell did tonight, bringing that bird home with a failing hydraulic system, that was masterful. Most pilots would have put down at the emergency strip. She read the situation perfectly and made the right call. The captain nodded, making notes on his tablet. I'm putting you in for a commendation, Mitchell. What you did tonight went above and beyond your assigned duties. You volunteered for a high-risk mission and executed it flawlessly despite significant mechanical complications. Sarah felt uncomfortable with the praise, but she knew enough to accept it graciously. Thank you, sir. I was just glad I could help. After the official debriefing ended, several of the SEALs approached her individually. Hayes, the grizzled operator who had turned around to look at her when she first stood up, shook her hand firmly. I'll admit, I had my doubts when you volunteered. But you proved me wrong in the best way possible. If I'm ever going into harm's way again, I want you flying. Others echoed similar sentiments. These were men who rarely gave compliments, whose respect was earned through action rather than words. Sarah felt a swell of pride that she tried to keep from showing too obviously on her face. As people began filtering out of the debriefing room, Frost hung back. When they were alone, he pulled up a chair next to Sarah. Can I ask you something? Of course, Sarah replied, curious about what the SEAL team leader wanted to know. Why did you stop flying combat missions? Your record shows you were one of the best. You could have had any assignment you wanted. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer. She had given the official reason earlier, but Frost deserved a more honest response. After 6 years of combat flying, I had seen a lot. Lost friends. Made emergency landings with wounded aboard and couldn't save them all. Every time I sat in that cockpit, I was making life and death decisions, and the weight of it started to break me down. She paused, collecting her thoughts. I didn't leave because I couldn't do it anymore. I left because I was afraid that one day I would become numb to it, that I would stop feeling the weight of those decisions. I didn't want to become someone who could watch people die and not be affected. So I stepped back, found a different way to serve. Frost nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. But tonight you stepped back in. Tonight was different, Sarah said. There wasn't time to overthink it. Someone needed a pilot, and I was the only option. The decision made itself. Maybe, Frost said thoughtfully. Or maybe you've always been ready to step up when it really matters. That's the mark of a true warrior, Mitchell. Not someone who seeks out glory, but someone who answers the call when it comes. His words stayed with Sarah long after he left. She sat alone in the debriefing room, thinking about what he had said and what the night had revealed about herself. For 2 years, she had convinced herself that she was content in her support role, that she had left combat operations behind permanently. But tonight had shown her something different. The moment she had taken those controls, something inside her had awakened. A part of herself she had thought was dormant, but had merely been waiting. The door opened, and the captain entered again. He carried a folder under his arm and wore an expression that suggested this was more than a casual check-in. Mitchell, do you have a few more minutes? Yes, sir, Sarah said, straightening in her chair despite her exhaustion. The captain sat down across from her and opened the folder. I've been looking at your full service record, not just the summary I saw earlier. Your performance evaluations are outstanding. Multiple commendations. Letter of recommendation from a brigadier general. You left quite an impression during your active duty time. Sarah waited, sensing that he was building up to something specific. The truth is, we've been struggling to find qualified pilots for special operations work. The skill set required is specific. Technical proficiency is necessary but not sufficient. We need people who can think tactically, who can stay calm under pressure, who can make split-second decisions that might mean the difference between mission success and failure. He paused, looking directly at her. Tonight you demonstrated all of those qualities. Sarah began to understand where this was going. Sir, I appreciate that, but I'm currently assigned to logistics coordination. I know, the captain acknowledged. And you're good at that too. But the question I have for you is simple. Where do you think you can do the most good? Tonight proved that your unique combination of skills is rare and valuable. We need pilots like you. The offer hung in the air between them. Sarah felt the pull of it, the temptation to return to what she knew she was exceptional at doing. But she also remembered the reasons she had stepped away, the toll that combat operations had taken on her mental and emotional state. Can I have some time to think about it? She asked finally. Take all the time you need, the captain said, standing. But Mitchell, consider this. You proved tonight that you haven't lost your edge. If anything, the break you took might have given you perspective that makes you even better at this job. Sometimes stepping away helps us come back stronger. After he left, Sarah remained in the conference room for another hour, wrestling with the decision. The rational part of her brain listed all the reasons why returning to combat flying would be difficult. The irregular schedule, the constant stress, the risk, the emotional burden. But another part of her, the part that had felt truly alive for the first time in 2 years while flying that mission, argued differently. She thought about the informant, about the intelligence he was providing, about the attacks that would be stopped because of what they had done tonight. She thought about Hayes and Frost and the other SEALs who had trusted her with their lives. She thought about future missions where her skills might make the same kind of difference. Finally, as dawn began to break outside the base, Sarah made her decision. She pulled out her phone and composed a message to the captain. It was brief and to the point. Sir, I'd like to discuss transitioning back to flight operations. Mitchell. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The response came back within minutes. Meet me at 0900. We'll talk specifics. Get some rest first. You've earned it. Sarah made her way to her quarters feeling exhausted but also energized in a way she hadn't experienced in a long time. She had rediscovered a part of herself tonight, and rather than running from it again, she was choosing to embrace it. When she finally lay down, sleep came surprisingly easily despite the adrenaline that had been coursing through her system hours earlier. Her dreams were peaceful. No nightmares of past missions or failures. Instead, she dreamed of flying, of vast open skies and the perfect control of a well-maintained aircraft responding to her every command. The meeting at 0900 was attended by the captain, Major Reeves, and a personnel officer who specialized in transfers and reassignments. They laid out the logistics of moving her back into a flight operations role. It would take some time to process the paperwork and complete the required recertification flights, but the captain made it clear that he wanted her as part of his aviation detachment. You'll be working closely with the special operations teams, he explained. The missions are varied, often unpredictable and always challenging. But based on what I saw last night, I think you're exactly what we need. Sarah agreed to the terms they outlined. The personnel officer explained the timeline, the training requirements, and the evaluation process she would need to complete. It was all standard procedure, but Sarah barely heard the details. Her mind was already moving forward, thinking about the missions ahead, the teams she would support, the difference she could make. Over the next few weeks, Sarah went through the formal process of returning to flight status. She completed the required check rides, demonstrating her profits. 3 months after that first mission, Sarah had fully integrated into the Special Operations Aviation Detachment. She had flown dozens of missions, each one different, each one demanding in its own way. Some were routine insertions and extractions. Others involved combat scenarios that tested every bit of her skill and judgment. She had developed a reputation among the operators as a pilot who could be trusted in any situation. Frost's team specifically requested her for their missions. The trust they had placed in her that first night had been validated repeatedly, and a mutual respect had grown between the pilot and the SEALs. They understood each other's capabilities and limitations, and that understanding made them more effective as a combined unit. One afternoon, Sarah was sitting in the operations center reviewing the flight plan for an upcoming mission when Hayes approached. He dropped into the seat next to her and studied the map she had pulled up on her screen. "Another mountain insertion," he observed. "Seems like we're always asking you to fly into the worst terrain imaginable," Sarah smiled. "That's because I'm good at it. Besides, the easy missions don't need someone with my experience. They need me for the ones that make other pilots nervous." Hayes nodded appreciatively. "You know, when you stood up that night and volunteered, I thought maybe you were overconfident, trying to prove something. But watching you work these past few months, I realize I had it wrong. You weren't trying to prove anything. You already knew what you could do. You were just waiting for the right moment to show everyone else." Sarah considered his words. "I think it was more complicated than that. I had convinced myself that I didn't need to fly combat missions anymore, that I could contribute in other ways. But that night reminded me of who I am at my core. I'm a pilot. It's not just what I do, it's who I am. And we're damn lucky for it," Hayes said sincerely. He stood up, preparing to leave. "See you at the brief tomorrow morning. Try to get some sleep tonight." After he left, Sarah returned to studying the flight plan, but her mind wandered to the journey she had taken over the past few months. The transition back to flight operations hadn't been without challenges. There had been moments of doubt, nights when the old anxieties had returned, times when she had questioned whether she had made the right decision. But those moments had become less frequent as she settled back into the rhythm of operational flying. She had found ways to cope with the stress that were healthier than before. She talked with the other pilots about the difficulties of the job. She maintained connections with friends outside the military, who helped her maintain perspective. She exercised regularly, not just to maintain the physical fitness required for her job, but because it helped clear her mind. Most importantly, she had learned to accept that some degree of fear and uncertainty was normal and even healthy. The person she had been before, trying to eliminate all fear and doubt, had been fighting a losing battle. The person she was now understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The next morning's mission went smoothly. Sarah inserted Frost's team into a remote area, where they needed to conduct surveillance on a suspected militant training camp. The flying was technical, requiring her to navigate through narrow valleys and stay below radar coverage, but it was well within her capabilities. She dropped the team precisely on target and extracted them 6 hours later without incident. As they flew back to base, Frost came up to the cockpit area. "Mitchell, I wanted to tell you something. My team is being considered for a particularly challenging operation next month. Deep penetration, high risk, critical intelligence value. If we get selected for it, I'm going to insist that you're our pilot. No one else. Just you." Sarah glanced back at him. "That's a lot of trust to place in one person." "You've earned it," Frost said simply. "Every single time we've gone out with you, you've been exactly what we needed. Calm, professional, skilled, and unflappable. Those aren't common qualities, especially in combination. So yes, it's a lot of trust, but it's trust that's been proven to be well placed." The mission Frost mentioned did come through, and it was indeed challenging. The target was a high-value individual deep in enemy territory, and the window for the operation was narrow. The planning took weeks, with every contingency examined and prepared for. Sarah was involved in every aspect of the planning that related to aviation, providing input on approach routes, fuel calculations, timing windows, and emergency procedures. When the night of the mission arrived, Sarah felt a familiar mix of anticipation and focus settle over her. This was a bigger operation than the first mission she had flown with Frost's team, with more moving parts and higher stakes. But she had prepared thoroughly, and she trusted both her skills and the team she would be supporting. The mission itself was a masterclass in special operations. Everything went according to plan, which in this business was almost unprecedented. Sarah's flying was precise, her timing perfect. The team infiltrated the target location, secured their objective, and was extracted without casualties. The high-value individual they captured proved to be exactly who intelligence had believed, and his capture disrupted an entire network of militant operations. In the debriefing after that mission, the captain, who had first asked if they had a combat pilot, made a point to address Sarah directly in front of the entire operations team. "Mitchell, when I asked that question months ago, I was hoping for someone competent. What we got was someone exceptional. Your contributions to this unit's success have been immeasurable. You've raised the standard for what we expect from our aviation assets." The room erupted in applause, and Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and pride. These were hardened warriors, people who had seen and done things most would never understand, and they were showing her genuine appreciation and respect. Later, sitting alone in the pilot's ready room, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the person she had been when she left combat flying, broken down by the accumulated weight of too many missions and too many close calls. She thought about the person she had tried to become in logistics, competent but unfulfilled. And she thought about the person she was now, someone who had found a way to integrate all of her experiences into something stronger. The truth was that standing up that night when the captain asked for a pilot hadn't just been about volunteering for a mission. It had been about reclaiming a part of herself that she had thought was lost. It had been about recognizing that running from her fears hadn't made them go away, but facing them head-on had made them manageable. She had learned that strength wasn't about never being afraid or never doubting herself. Strength was about feeling those things and choosing to act anyway. It was about recognizing her limits while also understanding her capabilities. It was about knowing when to step up and when to step back, and having the wisdom to tell the difference. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Frost. Team dinner tomorrow night. Celebrating the successful op. You're expected to attend. No excuses. Sarah smiled and typed back a quick confirmation. These men, these warriors who had initially been strangers but had become something like family, had given her something precious. They had given her a purpose that aligned with her skills, challenges that pushed her to be her best, and a community that understood the unique pressures of their shared profession. As she prepared to leave the ready room and head to her quarters for some well-earned rest, Sarah paused to look at a photo mounted on the wall. It showed a Blackhawk silhouetted against a desert sunset, a powerful image that captured both the beauty and the danger of what they did. She remembered taking that photo during one of her early missions with the unit. The aircraft in the photo represented so much more than just a machine. It represented freedom and purpose and the ability to make a real difference in the world. It represented the choice she had made to stop running from who she was and to embrace it fully, with all the joy and fear and responsibility that came with it. Sarah Mitchell had always been a pilot. For a while she had forgotten that truth or tried to hide from it, but when the moment came, when the SEAL captain asked if they had a combat pilot, something inside her had known the answer before her conscious mind could process it. She had risen silently without hesitation, because that was who she was, and in that moment of standing up, she had reclaimed not just her role as a pilot, but her identity as someone who could be counted on when it mattered most. The missions would continue, some easy and some impossibly difficult. There would be more close calls, more moments of fear and doubt, but Sarah now understood that those challenges weren't obstacles to overcome, but rather the very things that gave her purpose meaning. She was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, and that knowledge, that certainty was worth every risk, every sleepless night, every moment of fear, because in the end, the question wasn't whether she could do this job. The question had always been whether she would choose to, and she had answered with a simple gesture that had changed everything. She had stood up.